Sarah Martinez had always been the reliable one in her family. At 28, she worked as a park ranger in the remote wilderness of Montana, spending her days hiking rugged trails and ensuring the safety of visitors who came to explore the vast mountainous terrain. Her job required her to venture into areas where cell phone signals disappeared and civilization felt like a distant memory. On a crisp October morning, Sarah kissed her husband David goodbye and promised to be home by evening. She was scheduled to check on a series of trail markers that had been damaged by recent storms. The route would take her deep into Bear Creek Canyon, a section of the park known for its breathtaking views but also its unpredictable weather patterns. David watched from their kitchen window as Sarah loaded her backpack into her Park Service vehicle. She waved at him with that familiar smile that had captured his heart 5 years earlier. Neither of them knew this would be the last time they would see each other for what felt like an eternity. The morning air was cold and sharp as Sarah began her hike. She had walked these trails countless times, but today something felt different. The wind carried an unusual chill, and the sky held a gray heaviness that made her quicken her pace. She wanted to complete her inspection and return to the warmth of her truck before any weather changes occurred. 3 hours into her hike, Sarah reached the damaged trail markers. She spent time photographing the damage and making detailed notes about what repairs would be needed. As she worked, she noticed the wind picking up strength and the temperature dropping rapidly. Dark clouds were forming over the mountain peaks, moving faster than she had anticipated. Sarah made the decision to head back immediately. She had covered about half the distance to her vehicle when the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, what started as light flurries transformed into a heavy snowfall that reduced visibility to just a few feet ahead of her. The trail that had been clearly marked during her morning hike was now becoming increasingly difficult to follow. Snow accumulated quickly on the ground, covering familiar landmarks and making each step treacherous. Sarah pulled out her compass and GPS device, but the thick cloud cover was interfering with satellite signals. As afternoon turned to early evening, Sarah realized she was no longer on the main trail. The snowstorm had intensified into what meteorologists would later call a freak blizzard that caught the entire region off guard. Temperatures plummeted to dangerous levels, and the wind howled through the canyon with a force that made forward progress nearly impossible. Sarah sought shelter behind a large boulder and tried to radio for help, but the storm was interfering with all communication. She knew the Park Service protocol required her to check in by 6 o'clock, and her failure to do so would trigger a search operation. She just needed to survive until help arrived. Meanwhile, back at park headquarters, David was growing increasingly worried. Sarah was always punctual and never failed to check in as scheduled. When 6 o'clock came and went without any word from his wife, he immediately contacted the Park Service emergency team. The search coordinator, Captain Reynolds, tried to remain optimistic as he organized the initial search efforts. However, the weather conditions made any immediate rescue attempt extremely dangerous. The blizzard had grounded helicopters and made vehicle access to many areas impossible. As night fell, temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. David paced the floors of their small cabin, unable to eat or sleep. He kept stepping outside to scan the darkness, hoping to see headlights approaching their driveway. The silence was deafening except for the howling wind that seemed to mock his growing desperation. Search teams attempted to reach Bear Creek Canyon on foot but were forced to turn back after only a few miles. The snow was accumulating at a rate of 3 inches per hour, and visibility remained near zero. Captain Reynolds made the difficult decision to suspend search operations until morning, hoping the storm would pass overnight. Sarah spent the night huddled behind the boulder, using emergency techniques she had learned during her ranger training. She rationed the few energy bars in her pack and melted snow for drinking water. Every hour, she forced herself to move around to maintain circulation, fighting against the cold that seemed determined to claim her. When dawn broke, the storm had not subsided. If anything, the conditions had worsened overnight. David joined the search teams despite official protocols that typically excluded family members. His intimate knowledge of Sarah's hiking preferences and his desperate determination made him a valuable addition to the rescue effort. The search expanded to include teams from 3 neighboring counties. Helicopters remained grounded, but snowmobiles and cross-country ski teams were deployed to cover as much ground as possible. Every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of finding Sarah alive in such extreme conditions. On the second day, searchers found Sarah's Park Service vehicle buried under 4 feet of snow in the parking area where she had left it. The discovery confirmed her location but provided no clues about her current whereabouts. The trail she had intended to follow was now completely obscured by the continuing snowfall. David refused to leave the search area. He had not slept in 48 hours and was running on nothing but coffee and sheer determination. Other family members arrived to support him, but he insisted on continuing to search even when rescue coordinators suggested he return home to rest. By the third day, the storm began to show signs of weakening. Search teams were able to penetrate deeper into Bear Creek Canyon, following Sarah's planned route as closely as possible. They found evidence of her presence at the damaged trail markers, confirming that she had reached her intended destination before the weather turned dangerous. The search area was expanded to include several square miles of rugged terrain. Every cave, overhang, and possible shelter was systematically checked. Search dogs were brought in to help detect any human scent, but the heavy snow and continuing wind made their job extremely difficult. As the fourth day dawned, hopes were beginning to fade. Survival experts explained that even with proper training and equipment, the chances of surviving more than 3 days in such extreme conditions were minimal. Some search team members quietly began to discuss transitioning from a rescue operation to a recovery mission. David refused to accept such discussions. He continued hiking through the snow-covered wilderness, calling Sarah's name and checking areas that official search teams had not yet reached. His hands were frostbitten, and his face was raw from exposure to the wind, but he would not give up. On the 5th day, the snowstorm finally ended. The sun emerged for the first time in nearly a week, creating a brilliant white landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. Search efforts resumed with renewed intensity now that weather conditions allowed helicopters to join the operation. Captain Reynolds coordinated aerial searches while ground teams continued their systematic coverage of the area. The fresh snow had covered any tracks Sarah might have left, making the search similar to looking for a needle in a haystack that covered dozens of square miles. Sarah's parents arrived from California, and her sister flew in from Texas. The small Park Service office became an unofficial family gathering place where everyone waited for updates and tried to support each other through the growing despair. Local news crews began covering the story, bringing regional attention to the search efforts. Community volunteers joined the official search teams. Local businesses donated food and supplies to support the rescue operation. The story of the missing park ranger touched the hearts of people throughout the region, and many felt compelled to help in whatever way they could. By the end of the first week, more than 200 people were involved in the search effort. The operation had become one of the largest rescue missions in the state's recent history. Despite the massive effort and resources being deployed, no trace of Sarah had been found beyond the evidence at the trail markers. Medical experts consulted on the case concluded that survival beyond 1 week in the conditions Sarah had encountered was virtually impossible. The temperature had not risen above 0 degrees during the entire week, and the combination of wind, snow, and exposure would have been fatal to anyone without adequate shelter. Captain Reynolds faced the difficult task of informing David and the family that the search was being scaled back. While efforts would continue, they were now operating under the assumption that Sarah had not survived the storm. The official status was changed from missing person to presumed dead. David collapsed when he heard the news. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the week-long search had pushed him beyond his limits. He was taken to the local hospital where doctors insisted he remain overnight for observation and treatment of his frostbite injuries. The news of Sarah's presumed death spread quickly through the community and beyond. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the dedicated park ranger who had lost her life in the line of duty. Plans began for a memorial service to honor her memory and her years of service protecting the wilderness she loved. Sarah's family struggled to accept the reality of their loss. Without a body to bury, the grieving process felt incomplete and surreal. They found themselves caught between hope and despair, unable to fully let go while also trying to face the likelihood that Sarah was gone forever. The search continued on a limited basis for several more days, but the focus had shifted from rescue to recovery. Small teams of experienced searchers continued to check areas where a body might be found, but even this effort was hampered by the vast amount of snow that continued to accumulate in the mountains. 2 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, a small funeral service was held at the local church. The building was packed with family, friends, colleagues, and community members who had been touched by the story. David struggled through a eulogy that celebrated Sarah's life and her dedication to protecting the natural areas that had ultimately claimed her life. The empty casket was lowered into the ground as a symbol of their love and loss, even though Sarah's body had never been recovered. David stood at the graveside long after other mourners had left, staring at the headstone that bore his wife's name and the dates of her birth and presumed death. While the world believed Sarah Martinez was dead and buried, she was actually fighting the battle of her life 30 miles from where searchers had been looking for her. The blizzard that trapped her had done more than just obscure her path home. It had swept her into a completely different section of the wilderness, far from any marked trail or recognizable landmark. When the storm first hit, Sarah had tried to retrace her steps to the parking area where her vehicle waited. However, the combination of whiteout conditions and increasing panic had led her further away from safety instead of toward it. By the time she realized her mistake, she was hopelessly lost in terrain she did not recognize. The boulder where she had initially sought shelter was not large enough to protect her from the full fury of the storm. As the wind increased and snow accumulated around her, Sarah made the critical decision to search for better protection. She stumbled through the darkness until she discovered what appeared to be a small cave entrance hidden behind a cluster of fallen trees. The cave was actually more of a deep crevice in the rock face, but it provided crucial protection from the wind and snow. Sarah crawled inside and immediately began using her emergency training to create a survival shelter. She gathered pine needles and small branches to create insulation between her body and the cold stone floor. Her emergency kit contained basic supplies, but nothing designed for extended survival in extreme conditions. She had 2 energy bars, a small first aid kit, waterproof matches, and a knife. Her water bottle had frozen solid during her first night in the cold, leaving her dependent on melting snow for hydration. Sarah understood that her survival depended on conserving energy and maintaining body heat. She rationed her food carefully, eating only small amounts each day to make her supplies last as long as possible. She forced herself to exercise regularly inside the cramped cave to maintain circulation and prevent frostbite. The psychological challenge of survival proved to be as difficult as the physical demands. During the long, dark hours, Sarah battled waves of panic and despair. She knew that search teams would be looking for her, but she had no way to signal her location or communicate her desperate situation. She created a mental routine to help maintain her sanity during the endless hours of darkness. Sarah recited poetry she had memorized in college, sang songs from her childhood, and mentally planned every detail of the home improvements she and David had been discussing before her disappearance. Water became her most critical need after her initial supplies ran out. Sarah discovered that she could melt snow by holding it against her body, but this process consumed precious body heat. She learned to collect icicles from the cave entrance, which melted more efficiently than snow and provided cleaner water. Food became an increasingly desperate concern as her energy bars disappeared. Sarah had learned basic wilderness survival skills during her ranger training, but putting that knowledge into practice during a life-threatening emergency proved far more difficult than she had anticipated. She began searching the immediate area around her cave for anything edible. Pine needles could be chewed for their vitamin content, though they provided no calories. Sarah found a few rose hips that had survived the early winter, and she carefully rationed these precious sources of nutrition. The cold was relentless and unforgiving. Even inside the cave, temperatures remained well below freezing. Sarah's sleeping bag was rated for cold weather camping, but not for the extreme conditions she faced. She spent hours each day gathering pine needles and dry grass to add layers of insulation around her sleeping area. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Sarah recognized the early symptoms and forced herself to exercise whenever she felt her thinking becoming cloudy or her movements becoming sluggish. She did jumping jacks, push-ups, and other calisthenics in the confined space of the cave, generating body heat through physical activity. Her feet suffered the most damage from the cold. Despite her winter boots and wool socks, frostbite began affecting several of her toes. Sarah used techniques from her first aid training to treat the injuries, but, without proper medical supplies, she could only do basic wound care and hope to prevent infection. Week after week passed with no sign of rescue. Sarah had no way of knowing that search teams had given up looking for her or that her family had already held her funeral. She maintained hope by believing that the search would continue and that she just needed to survive until help arrived. The mental discipline required for long-term survival tested every aspect of Sarah's character. She experienced periods of rage, despair, and acceptance that cycled through her consciousness like the changing weather outside her shelter. Some days she felt confident and determined, while others brought crushing hopelessness. Sarah began talking to herself to combat the isolation and silence. She held conversations with David, her parents, and her colleagues, imagining their responses and drawing comfort from these mental interactions. These imaginary conversations helped her maintain her sense of identity and connection to the world she hoped to rejoin. As winter deepened, food became an increasingly critical problem. Sarah had lost significant weight, and her body was beginning to consume its own muscle tissue for energy. She knew that without additional nutrition, her strength would continue to decline until she could no longer maintain the physical activities necessary for survival. Desperation drove her to expand her search area despite the risks involved. Sarah began venturing further from her cave to look for anything that might provide calories or nutrition. She found tree bark that could be chewed and digested, though it provided minimal nutritional value. One day, while searching near a frozen stream, Sarah discovered animal tracks in the snow. Following the tracks led her to a rabbit that had apparently died from the cold. Although the meat was frozen solid, it represented more protein than she had consumed in weeks. She carefully prepared and cooked the meat using her waterproof matches and drywood she had been collecting. The discovery of the rabbit gave Sarah new hope and energy. She realized that if she could find one source of protein, there might be others in the area. She began setting simple snares using string from her backpack and sticks she carved with her knife. Her snares produced occasional results. Sarah caught 2 more rabbits over the following weeks, along with a squirrel that provided a small but crucial source of nutrition. Each successful catch felt like a major victory and renewed her determination to continue fighting for survival. Sarah also learned to identify which plants and roots might be edible, even in winter conditions. She found wild onions buried under the snow and discovered that certain tree roots could be dug up and chewed for their carbohydrate content. Every calorie became precious in her daily struggle to maintain her strength. The isolation began affecting her mental state in ways she had not anticipated. Sarah found herself having detailed conversations with imaginary companions and sometimes losing track of whether events were real or products of her stressed mind. She worked hard to maintain her grasp on reality by keeping a daily journal using a pencil and paper from her backpack. Her journal became a lifeline to sanity. Sarah recorded daily events, weather observations, and her thoughts and feelings about her situation. Writing helped her process the emotional trauma of her experience while also providing a record that might someday help others understand what she had endured. Physical deterioration was unavoidable despite her best efforts. Sarah's clothes hung loosely on her shrinking frame, and her face became gaunt and hollow. Her hair had grown long and matted, and her hands were permanently stained from digging for roots and preparing animal catches. The worst challenge came during the 3rd month of her ordeal. A severe infection developed in one of her frostbitten toes, causing intense pain and fever. Sarah knew that without antibiotics, the infection could spread and become life-threatening. She used everything in her first aid kit to clean and treat the wound, but her options were extremely limited. For several days, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as her body fought the infection. She was barely able to maintain her fire or gather snow for water. During this crisis, she came closer to death than at any previous point in her survival ordeal. Somehow, her immune system managed to control the infection without medical intervention. The fever broke after 5 days, leaving Sarah weak but alive. The experience taught her how precarious her situation remained and how quickly circumstances could shift from difficult to impossible. Spring's arrival brought new hope and new challenges. Warmer temperatures meant that Sarah no longer faced the constant threat of hypothermia, but they also brought increased activity from wild animals emerging from their winter dormancy. She had to remain constantly vigilant about bears and mountain lions that might view her as either a threat or potential prey. The melting snow revealed food sources that had been buried throughout the winter. Sarah found nuts, berries, and roots that provided better nutrition than anything she had been able to locate during the coldest months. Her strength began to return gradually as her diet improved. However, the psychological toll of months in isolation had left deep scars. Sarah found herself jumping at every sound and feeling panic whenever she moved too far from her cave. The safety and security of her small shelter had become both a blessing and a psychological prison. She knew that if rescue was going to come, she would need to help it find her. Sarah began preparing signals and markers that might catch the attention of any aircraft or search teams that might pass through the area. She gathered bright-colored items and arranged them in patterns that would be visible from above. As the snow continued to melt and trails became passable again, Sarah made the difficult decision that would change everything. She realized that she could not wait indefinitely for rescue to find her. If she wanted to see her family again, she would have to find her own way home. After 5 months of surviving in the wilderness, Sarah Martinez made the decision that would either save her life or end it. She could no longer wait for rescue teams that had long since given up searching for her. The spring thaw had opened new possibilities for travel, but it also meant that if she was going to attempt to find her way home, she needed to act soon before summer brought different dangers. Sarah spent 2 weeks preparing for her journey back to civilization. She had no map, no compass that worked reliably in the mountainous terrain, and no clear idea of which direction would lead her to safety. Her only advantages were her ranger training, her intimate knowledge of wilderness survival, and an unshakable determination to see David again. She fashioned a more portable shelter from materials in her cave and created a basic backpack from her torn clothing. Sarah gathered every edible plant and root she could find, knowing that food would be scarce during her trek. She also prepared emergency fire-starting materials and wrapped them carefully to keep them dry. The morning she left her cave felt like both a liberation and a terrifying leap into the unknown. The shelter had protected her through the worst winter of her life, but it had also become a prison that isolated her from any chance of rescue. Sarah took one last look at the small space that had saved her life and began walking toward what she hoped was east. Her physical condition was far from ideal for a long journey through difficult terrain. Months of limited nutrition had left her weak and underweight. The infection in her frostbitten toe had healed, but she walked with a noticeable limp. Her boots were falling apart, held together with improvised repairs using string and pieces of fabric. Sarah had decided to follow water sources whenever possible, reasoning that streams and rivers eventually led to larger bodies of water where human settlements were more likely to exist. This strategy would provide her with drinking water, but it also meant traveling through valleys and low-lying areas where the terrain was often marshy and difficult to navigate. The first week of her journey was exhausting but encouraging. Sarah managed to cover several miles each day despite her weakened condition. She found occasional sources of food and was able to maintain small fires at night for warmth and protection. Most importantly, she had not encountered any large predators that might view her as easy prey. However, the second week brought new challenges that tested her resolve and survival skills. Heavy spring rains made travel miserable and dangerous. Streams that had been easily crossable became raging torrents that forced Sarah to make long detours to find safe crossing points. Her improvised rain gear provided minimal protection from the constant dampness. The wet conditions made it nearly impossible to start fires, leaving Sarah cold and shivering through long nights. She was forced to take shelter wherever she could find protection from the rain, often spending hours huddled under rock overhangs or in small caves that reminded her of the shelter she had left behind. Food became increasingly difficult to find as Sarah moved through terrain that was less familiar to her. The plants and roots she had learned to identify near her cave were not always present in other areas. She lost weight rapidly during this period and began experiencing dizzy spells that made walking dangerous on narrow mountain paths. 3 weeks into her journey, Sarah made a crucial decision that probably saved her life. Instead of continuing to follow her chosen water source, she climbed to higher ground to get a better view of the surrounding landscape. From a rocky outcrop, she spotted something that filled her with hope and terror in equal measure. In the distance, perhaps a day's walk away, she could see what appeared to be a road cutting through the forest. It was the first sign of human presence she had encountered since beginning her trek home. However, reaching the road would require crossing some of the most difficult terrain she had yet encountered. The route to the road led through dense forest, across several steep ravines, and over rocky ground that would be treacherous for someone in her weakened condition. Sarah knew that if she injured herself seriously during this final push, she would likely die within sight of potential rescue. She spent a full day resting and gathering her strength before attempting the final approach to the road. Sarah ate every edible thing she could find and forced herself to drink as much water as possible. She also spent time mentally preparing for what might be her last chance to reach safety. The journey to the road took 2 grueling days instead of the one she had hoped. Sarah fell several times on the rocky ground, reopening wounds that had begun to heal and creating new injuries. Her makeshift boots finally fell apart completely, forcing her to wrap her feet in strips of fabric that provided minimal protection. By the time Sarah finally reached the edge of the forest and could see the road clearly, she was near collapse. The pavement stretched in both directions with no signs of recent traffic, but tire tracks in the soft shoulder proved that vehicles did use this route. She just needed to survive long enough for someone to drive by. Sarah positioned herself where she would be visible to approaching traffic and began the waiting game that would determine whether her months of survival had been worth the struggle. She had no idea how frequently the road was used or whether anyone would stop to help a disheveled woman who looked more like a wild animal than a human being. The first vehicle passed without stopping. Sarah waved frantically and called out, but the pickup truck accelerated past her without even slowing down. The driver probably could not process what he was seeing or perhaps assumed she was dangerous. Sarah felt crushing disappointment but forced herself to remain optimistic. Hours passed with no additional traffic. Sarah began to worry that the road was rarely used and that she might die within sight of potential rescue. She used the waiting time to clean herself up as much as possible, hoping to appear less threatening to the next driver who might pass by. Late in the afternoon, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of a diesel engine approaching from the east. She positioned herself in the middle of the road where the driver could not avoid seeing her and would be forced to either stop or drive around her. The approaching vehicle was a logging truck, and the driver had little choice but to bring his heavy rig to a stop. Jake Morrison had been driving logging trucks through these mountains for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like the apparition standing in his path. The woman was emaciated, dirty, and dressed in tattered clothing that looked like it had been assembled from random scraps. Her hair was matted and wild, and her face was gaunt and sunburned. Jake's first instinct was to call the sheriff and report what appeared to be either a mentally ill person or someone who had been the victim of a crime. However, something in Sarah's eyes convinced him that she was lucid and genuinely in need of help. He rolled down his window and asked if she needed assistance. Sarah could barely speak when she tried to respond to Jake's question. Months of limited conversation had left her voice hoarse and weak. She managed to whisper that she had been lost in the wilderness and needed help getting to a hospital or police station. Jake immediately radioed his dispatcher and requested that emergency services meet them at the next town. The ride in Jake's truck felt surreal to Sarah after so many months of isolation and silence. The noise of the diesel engine, the movement of the vehicle, and even the simple presence of another human being overwhelmed her senses. She found herself crying uncontrollably as the reality of her rescue began to sink in. Jake tried to make conversation during the drive, but Sarah was too emotional and physically exhausted to provide coherent answers to his questions. She managed to tell him her name and that she worked as a park ranger, but the details of her ordeal would have to wait until she had recovered some of her strength. The emergency medical team was waiting when Jake's truck pulled into the small town of Cedar Falls. Paramedics immediately began assessing Sarah's condition while trying to gather information about her identity and medical history. Her driver's license had long since been lost, but her description of working as a park ranger provided the first clue to her identity. When the paramedics radioed Sarah's name and description to the regional medical center, the response was immediate and shocking. Sarah Martinez was listed in their system as deceased, with a death certificate filed months earlier. The emergency room staff had to verify her identity multiple times before they could believe that a woman who had been legally dead was sitting in their ambulance. The news of Sarah's arrival spread rapidly through the small medical facility and beyond. Word reached the Park Service within hours, and Captain Reynolds immediately contacted David with the impossible news that his wife was alive and receiving medical treatment 50 miles from their home. David's reaction to the phone call was pure disbelief followed by overwhelming joy and relief. He had spent months grieving Sarah's death and trying to rebuild his life around her absence. The news that she was alive seemed too good to be true, but Captain Reynolds assured him that medical personnel had confirmed her identity through multiple means. The drive to Cedar Falls took David less than an hour, though it felt like an eternity. He was escorted to Sarah's hospital room by medical staff who had prepared him for the physical changes her ordeal had caused. Nothing could have prepared him for seeing his wife's dramatically altered appearance, but his joy at her survival overshadowed his shock at her condition. Sarah's reunion with David was emotional beyond description. Months of believing she would never see him again had made every moment of their reunion precious and overwhelming. They held each other and cried for nearly an hour before Sarah felt strong enough to begin explaining what had happened to her. The medical evaluation revealed the full extent of what Sarah's body had endured during her survival ordeal. She had lost 35 pounds from her already slim frame. Several toes showed permanent damage from frostbite. Her hair and nails showed clear signs of prolonged malnutrition, and her muscle mass had decreased significantly. However, the doctors were amazed that she had survived such extreme conditions for so long with relatively few permanent injuries. Her wilderness training and mental toughness had clearly saved her life multiple times during the ordeal. With proper nutrition and medical care, most of her physical problems would heal completely over time. The psychological impact would take longer to address. Sarah experienced severe anxiety whenever she was separated from David, even for brief medical procedures. Loud noises and sudden movements triggered panic responses. The months of isolation and constant danger had left emotional scars that would require professional counseling to heal. News of Sarah's miraculous survival spread far beyond their small community. National media outlets picked up the story of the park ranger who had survived 5 months in the wilderness and walked out on her own. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as people wanted to hear every detail of her incredible ordeal. The Park Service launched a full investigation into the failed search operation that had missed finding Sarah during the critical early weeks of her disappearance. While no single person was blamed for the failure, the case led to significant changes in search protocols and equipment used for wilderness rescue operations. Sarah's cave was eventually located by investigators who were amazed at the survival shelter she had created with minimal resources. The site became an unofficial monument to human endurance and the will to survive against impossible odds. Park Service training programs began using Sarah's techniques as examples of effective wilderness survival strategies. Recovery was a slow and sometimes difficult process. Sarah had to relearn how to exist in normal society after months of focusing only on day-to-day survival. Simple things like grocery shopping or driving a car felt overwhelming after her extended isolation from civilization. Physical therapy helped Sarah regain much of her lost strength and muscle mass. The limp from her frostbitten toe improved significantly, though she would always walk with a slight irregularity that reminded her daily of her ordeal. More challenging was learning to trust that her basic needs for food, water, and shelter would always be available. Sarah returned to work as a park ranger 6 months after her rescue, but her approach to the job had changed dramatically. She became an advocate for improved safety protocols and better emergency equipment for rangers working in remote areas. Her near-death experience had given her a unique perspective on wilderness safety that benefited both colleagues and park visitors. The experience also transformed Sarah's relationship with David and her appreciation for the simple joys of daily life. Having faced the real possibility of never seeing him again, every ordinary moment together felt like a gift. They had learned not to take their time together for granted. Sarah began speaking at survival training seminars and wilderness safety conferences, sharing the lessons she had learned during her ordeal. Her story inspired other outdoor enthusiasts while providing practical knowledge that could save lives in emergency situations. She found purpose in helping others prepare for the unexpected challenges that wilderness activities could present. Years later, Sarah would reflect on her 5 months in the wilderness as simultaneously the worst and most transformative experience of her life. The ordeal had nearly killed her, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and determination she never knew she possessed. Most importantly, it had brought her home to the people and life she cherished most.